This episode of Harvey Brownstone Interviews is brought to you by the Harvey Brownstone Talk Show Blend Coffee, available at hollywoodblends.com. Everyone's saying it's the best coffee they've ever tasted. Why not give it a try and see for yourself?
Hello, everyone. I'm Harvey Brownstone, and today's guest can truly be said to be descended from Hollywood royalty. Perhaps not in the traditional sense, because neither of his parents were movie stars, but his father was one of the most successful, powerful, and respected agents in the history of Hollywood, Norman Brokaw. Throughout his career, he represented some of the greatest legendary stars in history, including Marilyn Monroe, Elvis Presley, Barbara Stanwyck, Loretta Young, Susan Hayward, Natalie Wood, Kim Novak, Clint Eastwood, Dick Van Dyke, Donna Summer, and many more, including Olympic athletes like Mark Spitz and former President Gerald Ford and his wife Betty Ford. He was renowned for his professionalism, integrity, sincerity, enthusiasm, and above all, his steadfast loyalty and devotion to his clients. But until now, no one really knew the man behind a sterling professional reputation because he always shied away from center stage, preferring instead to shine the spotlight on his superstar clients. But now our guest, who was Norman Brokaw's son, has written a highly compelling and insightful book about his father entitled Driving Marilyn, The Life and Times of Legendary Hollywood Agent Norman Brokaw. The book tells the story of Norman Brokaw's remarkable 60-year journey, beginning in 1943, when at the age of 16, he started working in the mailroom at the illustrious William Morris Agency, and then worked his way up to president and then chairman and CEO of the company. Our guest spent 30 years as a publicist in Hollywood, representing many big stars, including Tyler Perry, for whom he ended up ghostwriting the #1 New York Times bestseller, Don't Make a Black Woman Take Off Her Earrings, Medea's uninhibited commentaries on love and life. That book, released in 2006, launched our guest into a new and highly successful career as an author, collaborator, and ghostwriter. His other books include Living with Purpose, An Activist's Guide to Listening, Learning, and Leading by Dorothy Height, It's Never Too Late, Getting Older, Wiser, and Worry-Free in Our Golden Years by Scott Page, There's No Traffic on the Extra Mile, Lessons on the Road from Dreams to Destiny by Ricky Minor, and he co-wrote Florence Henderson's best-selling memoir, Life is Not a Stage, From Broadway Baby to a Lovely Lady and Beyond. He also co-wrote Jane's Dust, A Tale of Talc, Deceit, and Death, along with Dr. Ronald E. Gordon, and he co-wrote Connect, The Ultimate Human Superpower, 38 Remarkable Journeys into the Inner Realm of Mind Power, together with Sam Beard. And in 2022, he published a delicious memoir entitled Perfect Moments. I'm delighted to welcome Joel Brokaw to our show. Joel, thank you so much for being here.
It's really a pleasure, Harvey. Thank you.
Joel, you made it very clear in your book that your father was extremely discreet. He would never betray his clients by disclosing anything juicy about them. In fact, he turned down a very lucrative offer to write a book, and you described him as a reluctant storyteller. So what made you decide to write this book?
Well, I in that book that you mentioned, Perfect Moments, I had a few vignettes about him, and a publisher read it and said, well, this book isn't really formatted well for us, but I'm really interested in your father. And to be really honest, I had a lot of trepidation about writing this book for the very reason you just mentioned, which is trying to uncover a lot of stories from him and find people who are still alive, who he worked with. So in a way, I was secretly hoping the publisher would have said, you know, we changed our mind. We're not sending you the contract. But it has been one of the most purposeful things, a real labor of love to write this book. And as soon as I started talking with people who worked with him, I was just incredibly touched by the affection that they had for him. I literally couldn't get people off the phone because they had so much devotion to him and had so many great stories. So I was off to the races.
Near the end of his life, you started interviewing your father about his clients, but his memory was already fading. Do you wish you had started sooner?
Oh, absolutely. But again, with you have to understand that in his mindset, it was sacrilegious for him to write a book. And towards the end of his life, there were just so many people who asked him to do it. He said, well, okay, maybe I'll give it a shot. And we got some really good material, which readers will see. But then if we reached a certain point where I would ask him about something that he had told me about maybe years or months earlier, and he had no memory of it any longer. And I knew it was time to stop at that point. And I could kick myself because there are so many of the people he worked with, for example, like Elvis and Colonel Parker. And I had to really basically do a forensic research job in talking to people to recreate what that relationship was like. So there were a lot of things that I know he would have had great stories. What
Your
could you do?
father's uncle was the legendary agent Johnny Hyde, who discovered Marilyn Monroe, among many other stars. It was Johnny Hyde who got your dad his job in the mailroom at William Morris. And I'm wondering, do you think that part of your father's ambition and motivation to succeed came from his desire to prove to everyone that he was worthy of the job and not just there because of nepotism?
Absolutely correct. Yes, my father was a very enthusiastic person and he loved talent. So it was almost like when he went in for his job interview to be the first mailroom trainee in the illustrious William Morris mailroom, he was just so excited. And he just felt like every day I have an opportunity to learn and grow. And he carried that spirit of enthusiasm and passion to his dying day.
Since I mentioned Johnny Hyde, I want to point out that your father was portrayed by Richard Gere in a TV movie called This Year's Blonde about Johnny Hyde's relationship with Marilyn Monroe. What did you think of how your father was portrayed?
Oh, I thought it was great. It was it was really fascinating to see how the young actor had captured my father's spirit. So yeah, I loved it, and I just recently saw a video of it, and and brought back those memories of even just the mannerisms of how he carried himself. It was very truthful.
While we're on the subject of Johnny Hyde and Marilyn Monroe, I have to mention that your father was there with Marilyn Monroe at the Brown Derby the night she met Joe DiMaggio for the first time. Did he ever talk to you about that night?
Yes, I did get that down on tape from him, and he recounted the whole dialogue of how it went down. And, for in the Me Too era, the somebody coming over to proposition Marilyn for Joe DiMaggio, a very famous actor indeed, who came over and said, Joe D wants to meet the young lady. It could be a little bit awkward in this day and age, but it was pretty much standard behavior. I guess back then nobody questioned it.
I know that Marilyn Monroe left the William Morris Agency after Johnny Hyde died in 1950, so your dad didn't get to work with her a long time, but did he ever talk about his impressions of her?
He really said he got on very well with her, that they had a really good relationship. And I think he really saw her intelligence, but also her vulnerability. And I think that's something that was very instructive for the rest of his career because he worked with a bevy of incredibly strong leading actresses. But there's always in most actors and actresses, there's a layer of insecurity about them. And I think it gave him an early lesson in terms of how to handle talent. And as George Slaughter, the man who brought us Laugh-In in the 1960s, said about my father, that not only was he a great agent, but he was also a lawyer, an accountant, a manager, but most importantly, a psychiatrist. So I think that's one of the things that I hope people will really enjoy about the book is that nobody really has a concept of what an agent does. But I think my father really typified that kind of holistic approach to dealing with talent, that he would be on the phone with them in the middle of the night and trying to bruise their or to soothe their bruised egos. And so he was really remarkable. He really cared about his clients and they really cared about him. And that's why they stayed with him for decades.
I was shocked to read in your book that Marilyn Monroe's housekeeper, Mrs. Murray, the woman who discovered Marilyn's dead body in her bedroom, was your nanny when you were a child. What was she like?
Well, I say that was one of the strangest episodes of my childhood. She was very, very nice, but I sensed, and I was about 9 years old at the time, and I sensed that there was something a little bit off with her. She was a little cold and seemed to be a little bit distant in her own way, but she was very pleasant otherwise. But keep in mind that I'm fairly certain that it was a matter of weeks and not months or years after she had found Marilyn's corpse that she started working with us, because my mother had gone into the mental hospital. She had a very severe mental illness when I was growing up, and my father needed someone. And I think that Marilyn's psychiatrist was the same psychiatrist that my mother had, and my father needed to have somebody to take care of my brothers and myself. And so he says, I have someone who's available. So it was Mrs. Murray.
That's so fascinating. Now, you mentioned a few moments ago that not a lot of people understand really what an agent does. Joel, when you were growing up, did you have any real understanding of what your father did for a living?
Yes and no. I mean, I think that and I could say this for all my other siblings as well, we understood that he was a man of importance and that he had a certain power and stature in his job, but we really didn't understand the nitty-gritty of it. If anything, the limited view that I had of him at work, I felt that there was a sense of excitement, but it didn't have that much attraction to me, because most of the clients that tried to get in his good favor were very insecure people, and they would come over the house on the weekends and hang out by the swimming pool. And I felt that they were rather miserable. So it didn't really have that kind of glamorous charge to it. It was kind of like, why are these people being nice to me? It doesn't feel sincere.
You said in your book that your father's unique gift as an agent was that he could smell talent in anyone within 30 seconds of meeting them. Is that the kind of skill you can learn, Joel, or is it an instinct that you just have to be born with?
That's a really good question, Harvey, but I don't really know. I think it's a little bit of both. I think that it's all where you place your priority in your relationships. And I think that he basically saw a spark in people. And it didn't have to be someone who was an actor or an actress. It could be a maitre d' in a restaurant. And one particular woman who I'm speaking about, he said, I want to talk to you. And she came into his office and she became a highly successful agent. But my father saw something in her. And he also felt the same way about the people who were starting out in the mailroom like he did. He had an open door towards them. And even David Geffen, who wrote the foreword to the book, that's how their relationship started, that my father liked to mentor young people. And it was a very smart move on his side, because that turned into very beneficial lifelong relationships.
Well, I'm really interested in that instinct because, in my opinion, it is an instinct. It isn't something you really can be taught. And my manager, Rick Marcelli, and his wonderful wife who works with him, Robin Bragg Marcelli, often talk about the certain sense they get about someone. Rick is renowned for recognizing talent very quickly and what he calls the it factor. And it's obvious that your dad had it. And it's just one of those gifts that I think people in show business seem to be able to tap into. And boy, did your dad ever had it. And I think it's interesting that you said that he was, part social worker, part therapist, part psychiatrist, because in your book, You described your father as essentially a salesman. Why did you use that description of him?
Well, I used it in the sense that he was selling a product, but he was selling a product that was a human being. And so it's not some inert, inanimate object like hardware or shoes. He was selling to someone who is flesh and blood, who has feelings and fears and anxieties and joys just like everyone else. And so it's like kind of trying to fix a racing locomotive while it's in operation. It's like there's things are constantly changing. And I think that's what he also loved about the business, was that it was never routine.
Given your father's association with Marilyn Monroe, Elvis, and many other big stars who died prematurely or who had substance abuse problems like Susan Hayward, did your dad ever talk about the pitfalls of being famous and what he thought was the healthiest way for a big star to handle fame?
Boy, I never really, Harvey, I wish I had the chance to really talk to him about it, but it always seemed like whenever we wanted to broach a subject with him that was negative in any kind of way, speaking about a client, it was, again, just against his MO to talk in any negative way about someone. But I think the situation that he proved time and time again and told in many of the stories is that there was a professional relationship. It was a loving, caring family relationship. But my father really didn't get involved in their personal lives unless the client really extended that invitation to them. So that there are so many of them who would say, yes, I have a problem and I want to do something about it, but then they would never listen to advice. So I think he was astute enough to know when to intercede. And he also was a master at delivering the information in like one line sentence that the person says, okay, I get that. You don't have to tell me anymore. I understand what you're saying.
But can you imagine how frustrating it must have been for your dad, who, after all, is making a living based on the talent and the availability of these people to deliver? And he sees someone who's a megastar and who is unfortunately wrapped up in emotional problems or substance abuse problems or some other obstacle that keeps them from really being able to maximize their potential. And he's their agent. I can't even imagine how frustrating it must be for someone in his position to see this talent dripping away, which is also affecting his reputation, his income. It's just amazing to me that he was able to do it that long and to deal with it at such a high level.
Well, he loved helping people. And so it wasn't always about, oh, I'm afraid that my payday is disappearing. He always believed that if you did the best you could and your intention was honorable, that the end result would work out. And if somebody needed help, he got them the best doctors, he got them into the best clinics. There's a wonderful story about Tony Orlando, about how my father got his career resurrected after a stay in a mental hospital and a drug addiction problem. And so, but he had a genius of being able to give them the right dose of the right medicine. But not everybody, he was realistic about human nature. Not everyone was prepared to deal with fame. And so there were lots of people that flamed out, and not everyone that he worked with became highly successful. But he always felt like, you have something special. Let's see what we can do together to help you reach your potential.
What a wonderful human being. And I have to mention, Tony Orlando has appeared on our show twice. We talked in depth, particularly in the first interview, about his substance abuse problem and how he overcame it. He has only the most wonderful things to say about your dad. He's become a very dear friend of mine, and
Wonderful.
It was a great thrill in reading your book to read about the journey that your father helped Tony take towards his recovery. I have to ask you this. Did your dad ever express an opinion about Elvis Presley's manager, Colonel Parker?
Again, that was the one area that if I had time with him right now, the first question that I would ask him was about that. But I was fortunate that there was a gentleman who was front and center at that time, who was a witness to that relationship. And from what I understand, they just had this kind of really tight trust. And that's why if a offer was coming into the agency, it had to go through my father, because Colonel Parker really trusted my dad and trusted his instincts and trusted his judgment. And there was just this mutual respect that they had. I remember hearing the phone ring and hearing my father talking to Colonel Parker, and it was almost like I felt like he was dealing with a military officer. He had such respect for him. But I think what I talk about in the book a lot is the fact that a lot of people who were really close to Colonel Parker feel like he's gotten a bum rap, that there's been all these movies that they need a villain. So you have this overweight, bombastic character who can fill that role to keep the story moving. But most of the people say that he was just an incredible person to have in your corner, and that he was just a really nice person as well. And so that kind of, it's not what people in the general public have as their impression.
No, and I have to say, when we had Steve Binder on the show, who was the director of the Elvis 1968 comeback special, he had nothing good to say about working with Colonel Parker. So it's very interesting to contrast what you're saying with what Steve Binder said on the show.
Oh yeah. Well, if you were in negotiation with him or doing a deal with him, you were dealing with a formidable person. But yeah, I mean, no one is, you can't paint anybody with the same brush. I mean, people have all their different sides, but in terms of, it's almost like, if you're a hockey player and you're very aggressive, nobody on the other team likes him, but if he's on your team, you love him. And that's sort of the way it was with Colonel Parker.
That's a good analogy. Your father was selected by senior management at William Morris to start the television department at a time when television was in its infancy. And he's the one who got Loretta Young and Barbara Stanwyck to star in their own TV shows. Do you think he realized back then how important television was going to become as an entertainment medium?
Well, I think upon first impression, when he was told by his boss that they wanted him to start the West Coast department of what they think is going to be called television, he saw it as a demotion and was very depressed about it. And then when he's given the assignment, he asked his boss, "How would you like me to proceed?" And his boss said, "I leave that up to you." But my father came up with a genius idea that basically jump-started the whole notion of dramatic and comedy television. The only thing that was out there at the time was Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz's program. But outside of that, television was just a lot of live programming of talking heads and bowling and wrestling and baseball and live news and some live theater. And so he basically came up with an idea of how to start filming television series. And those were the first big television series that came out, like Racket Squad and My Little Margie, and just a litany of those kind of programs. So in any case, it's kind of how it got started. And getting Loretta Young to make the jump, that started the whole process of getting big name talent who could see television as a great opportunity.
I mentioned Loretta Young. You've just mentioned her. You were her publicist for the last 15 years of her life. What were your impressions of her?
Oh, she was incredible. My job was basically to tell people no, except she did a couple of television movies in the early part of our association. But I absolutely adored her. My time with her, I just sort of said, I can't even imagine that I'm getting paid for this. It was so incredible. And she was so much fun. If you have out with having a meal with her, you just didn't want it to end because she was so much fun. You felt like there wasn't an age difference between you. She was so just like accessible and funny. And if she started telling stories about the old days, you were in for a real treat.
A lot of people don't realize that in addition to her great charisma and generosity of spirit, Loretta Young had great instincts about marketing and personal branding, right?
That's correct. And if anything, I think my father really learned about empowered women from Loretta Young. The term obviously did not exist back then, but she was someone who took charge of her enterprise. She was a very savvy businesswoman and she knew her brand. And so the lessons he learned cutting his teeth on Loretta, he was able to apply to all the other women like Natalie Wood and Kim Novak and Donna Summer, that he basically shared with them his stories about her and how to create a career of longevity and prosperity. And they all listened.
I don't know if your father had a favorite client, but the impression I got from your book is that Natalie Wood was probably one of his favorites. Am I right?
That's correct. Yes. And I think they were just all at a very young age. But Natalie was, I only met her a couple of times, but when you were in her presence, you realized that it was not an accident that she had the popularity that she had. She was so charismatic, and you just felt like, in back in the 1950s, kids were kind of patted on the head and to be seen and not heard, basically, and ignored. But she didn't have that feeling at all. She was so accessible and just a wonderful light that a little kid could see it in her. As I said, I can't say enough good things about her.
Your father represented President Gerald Ford and his wife Betty Ford after they lost the election. He got them book deals, TV appearances, speaking engagements. And is it true that he helped get the Betty Ford Clinic off the ground?
That's correct. Yes, I tell a story about that in the book that my father, while he was alive, would never tell about Betty Ford. There's not a lot of gossip in the book, and because I don't have a lot to share about it, but there was one story about a trip that they took and I won't say more about it, but that was sort of the impetus. When she came back from that trip, that's when her family did an intervention, and that was the beginning stage of the Betty Ford Center.
Your dad really did some great things. We were talking about Tony Orlando. I want to say a little bit more. It wasn't just that your dad helped him with rehab. Your father got Tony to play the lead on Broadway in Barnum, which required him to walk on a tightrope. And I want to tell you that when Tony was on our show, he talked about the major significance in his life of walking on that tightrope every night. It was a very therapeutic experience for him on multiple levels. I hope your dad knew that what he did for Tony was a real, as we say in Yiddish, a mitzvah.
Oh, for sure. Because again, part of his genius was that he knew the power of a small and simple gesture. He could cut to the chase. And so there are numerous examples of him being able, as I said, to find that perfect dose of the medicine that people would be willing to take. And I mean, someone like Dick Van Dyke, who my father put the Dick Van Dyke Show together for, he spoke of him saying that he was a great agent and did great deals for him, but what he respected Norman for the most was being a humanitarian. And so that's, as I said, it's not something that you can quantify in any kind of way, but I feel like when people read the book, and hopefully they'll be entertained by it, that they'll also kind of carry away the values that he had. It wasn't about like, what's in it for me? It's really more so like, again, what can we do together? And so my father realized every dream that he had in his life, but it wasn't because he was grasping for that goal. It was that he created these wonderful relationships, and the end station on many of those relationships were far beyond anybody's wildest expectations. So it's really about opening yourself up to the opportunities and not grasping and not being self-serving. And people love that about him.
Very, very much so. Now, your dad represented Bill Cosby for over 50 years. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, you also worked for him as a publicist. So, of course, I'm going to ask you, what's your reaction to all the disclosures that we've learned about Bill Cosby's predatory behavior?
Well, all I can say is that it is a tragedy of, like, you could look at Greek plays and not come up with a better tragedy than what has happened to him and all the people who were in his life, and from the people who worked for him to the alleged victims. It is a tragedy of epic proportions, because this was someone who did extraordinary good in our society in terms of race relations, in terms of education, just the list goes on. But what happened with him is that what he purportedly did is not something that's forgivable. And so as I said, it is profound sadness around the whole thing, all around. But it is, like, as I said, it's like a Greek tragedy.
I would think that for you, there's more than sadness. There must have been shock.
Well, I don't know. I mean, again, if you had a morality clause for every one of your clients, including my father during his illustrious career, then you wouldn't have any clients. So, one always had the sense that people misbehave, but it's just a question of what the magnitude of misbehavior is. And part of the thing that was very sad for me was that when my father passed away, there were a lot of obituaries in the London Times and New York Times, and there was always that undercurrent that, well, maybe he was part of the cover-up of Bill Cosby. And I put forward in the book my argument for why I don't believe that that was the case, because of the boundaries of the relationship and how very private the Cosby family was. You did not inquire into anything in their private life unless they brought it up themselves, because they had a history of dealing with racism, and they didn't want people to know how much property they owned and what their wealth was and where they lived and all of that. And that's very understandable. But again, I think I lay out a reasonable argument for why my father really didn't know the magnitude.
I find that very, very credible, believable. I don't think that someone like your dad, who was so well known in the business and he was so beloved, could possibly have allowed himself to be involved in anything sinister, because he was so principled. He was so careful about his ethics, his morals. I think that it would be a shame if people tarred your father with the same brush as Bill Cosby, because there's no indication from anyone in the industry that your father was anything but the most upstanding and the most principled and the kindest person in the business.
Well, thank you for that, Harvey. I think one of the things that I was very interested in asking his clients who are still with us, like, how did he deal with adversity? What would happen if a deal didn't go through? And he would always have a positive answer, like, there's something better coming around the corner. This wasn't the right situation. It's a favor that they didn't go forward. It's their loss, type of thing. So he would always be like a cheerleader in which people appreciated, again, because it's a very insecure business. Is the phone ever going to ring again? But he always had that spirit about him. And I think that if he were confronted with this, he couldn't say, "Oh, turn the other cheek" or something. It's like he wouldn't have had an answer. He would have had to stay true to his North Star.
Your dad was a very close friend and associate of Berry Gordy, the founder of Motown, especially after the Motown company moved to LA. And I understand he was very helpful to Mr. Gordy in the making of his first movie, Lady Sings the Blues, starring Diana Ross. Is that right?
That's right. Yes. Again, part of what people got with my father was my father knew everyone. And his assistant said, I sort of felt like I was 1 degree of separation from everyone in the universe. So that when Berry Gordy came to Hollywood and wanted to expand his media empire beyond just the recording industry, Berry Gordy was naturally a bit nervous about it because he was stepping out into this different world. And my father said to him, "Don't worry about it. I have connections." And so they just they had such laughs together, and as I said, Berry Gordy had wonderful insights about my father. And in some ways, I see the relationship that they have is probably one of the most impressive relationships of all, that they came from such different backgrounds, but what they had in common was they both loved talent and they knew what to do with it. And for me, Berry Gordy is kind of a hero because you can look at Martin Luther King on one end of the work that he did in the civil rights movement, but Berry Gordy, through his music, really from the heart was able to get people to move away from their prejudices.
He built a lot of bridges, that's for sure. I was very intrigued, Joel, by something you wrote in your book. You said, and I'm quoting you here, "Of all the categories of people in the performing arts, I would guess there are more assholes in the comedian category than any other." Why do you say that?
Well, but part of it is just based on my personal experience. But I feel like that a comedian is probably the most insecure because they don't have, if you're an actor, you have another actor to play off of. If you're a musician, you have your other musicians to feed off of. An actor comes out there and just has a microphone and an audience, and you're either going to hit or you're going to bomb. And so it takes a certain tough personality to excel in that kind of a pressure cooker. And so, as I said,
But why would that make you an asshole?
I don't know. I mean, it's a good question, but I feel like you have to really have a hard exterior about you. You don't take any crap from anybody because, people are hurling insults at you and all of that. I mean, I can look at like someone like Don Rickles, for example, who, was the master of insult. He was the sweetest guy. I would not put him in the asshole category. He was a lovely man. And Mort Saul, the satirical comedian who was brilliant, also one of the nicest people I've ever met. But as I said, it's like maybe on one hand, I can tell you of the people that I met that in that world that, I really genuinely enjoyed being around and loved the working relationship with them.
So, who were some of the really terrible assholes?
I'm not really at liberty to discuss that with you. So I'm giving you my father's default position of like, I don't want to speak negatively about anybody. So like my father was once asked, did you have any clients that you had to fire? And my father said, yes, Rick Moranis. And the person said, why did you fire him? And he says, he was a real jerk. So, but that was like about as much as you could get out of my father. And where I bring this up is talking about Joey Bishop, who my father had quite a successful run with and created lots of television shows for him and got him in lots of movies. And he was part of the Rat Pack and part of the Sands Hotel enterprise. But he wasn't a very nice person. And so he pissed off a lot of people who he shouldn't have pissed off, including my father. But trying to get the story out of him, what happened, impossible.
I can't imagine someone being successful enough to make it in show business, but being stupid enough to burn bridges with someone like Norman Brokaw. I mean, he stayed at the William Morris Agency for 60 years. But throughout his career, he got many offers for more lucrative and powerful jobs in the industry, including heading a major movie studio. But he always turned down those offers. Why do you think he did that?
He just loved being an agent. That's the simple answer. He loved everything about it. And he felt like he could do everything that he wanted to do. I think he also liked diversity of talent that came his way. I felt like if he had moved off to become a studio head, he would have felt really boxed in by it. He had that kind of entrepreneurial spirit that he could launch things and take a chance on things. And he had mentors who really loved his talent and gave him lots of opportunity to go out on a limb. And he loved being able to do that. And he was most of the time able to pull it off.
Yeah, I think your dad, from what I can sense from the book, is that he was a nurturer. He found fulfillment in nurturing the talent of his clients, which is really a very rare and wonderful and compassionate talent that he had himself. Now, when you were a teenager, you spent 2 summers as an intern working in the mailroom at William Morris, where your father
Yes.
started out. What was that experience like?
Oh, it was incredible. I could just share with you one experience, which is not in the book, but it was like a real introduction to the adult world. And just to see the personalities of these agents and see how they worked and their sense of humor and all of that. But to give you one example, one of the other kids I was working with, we sat and we had our sack lunches and went into his father's office. And we're sitting there about to bite into a cheese sandwich or something like that. And we look up and Katharine Hepburn walks in. And she says, "Oh, boys, I hope I'm not disturbing you." And our jaws kind of dropped. She said, "I just have a couple of contracts I have to sign. Don't let me bother you." And we're just like, can't believe it. So, it wasn't that often that I would get starstruck, but that one was like beyond the beyond.
I can't even imagine. It's giving me goosebumps just thinking about that. Now, in 2011, Joel, in recognition of your father's pioneering contributions to the television industry, he received the Governor's Award from the Academy of Television Arts and Sciences. It was the first and only time an Emmy Award has been given to an agent. Were you in the audience that night to see your dad get the award?
Oh, absolutely. And the funny thing was after he got the award, he was backstage and we were having like a little reception for him, and he was holding on to that award like you couldn't have torn it out of his hands. He was so proud of that. And he, keep in mind, he was again one of these people who was behind the scenes, and getting any kind of recognition, you'd have to really, if like lots of charities wanted to honor him, and unless it was something really, really important to him and to that cause, he would turn them down. Because he said, "Oh, I don't want them to have to bother my clients for stuff." But this was like, it happened really towards the last part of his active life. And it was just a wonderful punctuation for his life that he was getting the recognition for what he did.
And what a great thing for you to see your dad honored in that way. The next thing I want to ask you about is the Norman Brokaw you knew as a father. You described him in your book as a workaholic, control freak, a firm taskmaster who was emotionally unavailable and not someone who was relaxed and playful. It sounds, Joel, like he had a very different personality at home than he had at work. Is that a fair comment?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is a fair comment. I think that, we all develop our personalities based on our life experiences. And I go through in some detail about his childhood. And it was like one of these very, very happy childhoods, the first few years of his life. And then suddenly the rug got pulled out from under him, be it, deaths and loss of the stock market crash, losing the family wealth, just on and on and on, just things chipped away. And so I think that he had a certain amount of childlike fear about family that manifested in the sense that he became a control freak, that he didn't want us to go through what he went through. And so, for example, he lost his father when he was 13 years old, and it was very devastating for him. So the way the mind can twist that is to say, well, I don't want my kids to get as close to me as I was to my father, because if I die, I don't want them to go through the pain that I went through. And so, and then my mother's mental illness and so forth, he was facing sort of an out of control situation. So what's the proper response? You become a control freak. So people would always come to me, his clients and associates would say, oh, your father is so wonderful. I love your father. You're so lucky to have him as your father. And I would say, are you sure you're talking about the same person? And it's not that he was a bad dad. He was in some ways, many ways, typical of 1950s and 1960s fathers who were, the breadwinners and didn't change diapers and didn't get on the floor and play with you. But on the other hand, though, he just, his work was everything. He was happy, and he could walk, he'd close the door on a problem, but you come home and it's facing you right there. He was great if you had a crisis, if you needed help. He was there in a heartbeat, and we loved him for that. But we kind of understood that it was, his love was shown in a different kind of way, and you had to just accept that and go with it, and take all the good that went around. There was a lot of fun too.
Did the experience of writing the book give you a new insight or a new perspective into your dad?
For sure, in ways, in the fine details of knowing the way that he worked. For example, the chapter I wrote on Mark Spitz was just a wonderful interview I had with him. And Mark really was able to dissect for me the way my father's brain worked. And so that was incredibly insightful. But the other thing was that I kind of had a faulty judgment about my father, because he had no friends and no hobbies outside of his work. And I felt like that was a shortcoming, especially when he got older and his career started to wind down. He didn't have anything to fall back on. And I said, boy, there you go. He didn't have a garden and scuba diving and cooking like I do. He had nothing left. But then in talking to all of his clients, they told me how much fun it was going out to dinner with him. And I realized that he had everything he wanted in a social life. So I had to back off of my prejudice that, oh, his life was deficient because he didn't have other well-rounded interests.
Yeah, for sure. He had one of those rare careers that was both a professional relationship and a social life. It's very true. Now, your dad often said the main attribute of genius is simplicity. What do you think he meant by that?
Well, I think that it's more so that sometimes when our lives and our minds are so cluttered, and we're kind of like these hamsters on the wheel the whole time. We're just constantly chasing after things. And my father was able to notice something really simple. And again, I mentioned that earlier, that he had a way of being able to distill a life lesson into maybe just one phrase that could get somebody to say, aha, the light bulb goes on. So he was able to identify that. And sometimes, in the self-help realm, you could write a long book about, fixing your problems. But if somebody isn't really willing to change and really willing to listen, it's all for naught. And he had that ability to listen and to identify and see the clear path right in front of him. And it was simple. It was like, what's the one thing you can do, put you into action on behalf of yourself? And he had that talent. That's why I say he would have been a great social worker.
Well, for sure. You mentioned that David Geffen wrote the foreword to your book. He described your father as the last of a dying breed. Joel, why do you think that agents like Norman Brokaw just don't exist anymore?
I don't know if that's completely true. I think that, again, the industry has changed so much and the profession has changed that maybe the job description isn't the same any longer. But I really maintain that the values that he had are things that anyone can apply to any profession and make a success out of it. And so, yes, I mean, he was in the right place at the right time during the pioneering ages of when vaudeville and radio were fading out and television was beginning, and going into sports and politics before anyone dared to ever do that. He was able to see opportunities where other people saw limitations. So so as I said, I think the the trappings and the framework are very different. But I spoke to one agent who I sent the book, and he just loved it, and he started talking about himself. Well, I do the same thing that your father did, and I said, okay, this is the proof and point that the ground rules are still the same.
It's good to hear that. I can certainly tell you that my manager, Rick Marcelli, is very much cut in the same cloth as Norman Brokaw. In your book, you credited the internet, social media, and reality television for changing the landscape and the culture and the mentality of the entertainment industry. How do you think your dad would have coped with those changes?
Well, again, change is the only thing that's constant. And, when they went from the player piano roll to the gramophone, people were shaking in their boots. Again, I think my father would have always, he just sort of said, talent will always rise to the occasion. And so I have no doubt that he would have had done well. I think what changed was that the sort of family atmosphere of the agency and the way of doing business changed. It became a lot more cutthroat, and it became a little bit more of this what's in it for me situation, like how can we benefit? And there wasn't the loyalty to the company that was really part of his generation. There was no gold watch that people were aspiring to any longer. And so that's where things are different.
That's a big, big difference. I was very surprised to read in your book that after your dad passed away, his secretary, Mary, burned his Rolodex, which probably should have gone to the Smithsonian. Do you know
Yeah.
why she did that?
I think that she just had such profound respect for him. She, out of, you let me just say that I really value my relationship with her because I could see what my father saw in her. And she was the perfect person. My stepmother said that if she hadn't come along, that Mary would have been the perfect wife for him. She was just so incredible. She was just a very gifted person. But yeah, I leave that as kind of, a big if. There are some people that read that and say, oh boy, I wish that she'd given it to the Smithsonian or something. But she sort of said, I think this is what he would have wanted.
Well, given how private and protective your father was about his clients, how do you think he would feel about the book?
It's interesting. Some people, Harvey, who knew him really, really well, their universal comment is, I could see him taking it off the shelf and showing it to me. He would be so proud of you, and all of that. So I think I honored, I tried, as being a ghostwriter, you have to be able to get into somebody's skull and almost sort of say, well, what, how do they want to say this and all of that. And in a way, I felt like I always had him there. He was there sitting next to me while I was writing it. And in a way, I looked at it as a gift that I got an extra 9 or 10 months together with him out of that. So I think he was very happy with it. He would be very happy with it.
I think that's such a lovely thing to say because when I was reading your book, I felt like he was sitting next to me. And it must, I hope, make you feel good to know that you've immortalized your dad by writing this book. That's got to be a great feeling.
Oh, it certainly is because, I mean, it was not to get morbid, but like I'm 71 years old and I was like saying, I just want to live long enough to get this book out. It's like you just have friends dropping off like flies and just sort of say, this is so important to me. I really want to make sure that I get this out. And it's been, really just an incredible delight that people like yourself are experiencing him and seeing the value in it. I mean, not everybody that's picked up the book loves it because it's not your typical biography. It's a very kind of emotional book in a way. There's a lot of heart energy in it, and it's not necessarily, part of it is very specific and based on the interviews that I did with him, and then it's forensic work. So it's kind of got a little bit of a weird quality to it. But some people love it, and most people love it, and a few people have felt uncomfortable about it. So
I think our viewers will love it because our viewers are lovers of classic Hollywood, and the people that he got to know and help are really shining through the book. And also that sense that he was like a family member to his clients really warms the heart of anyone who's ever wondered what it must have been like to be a celebrity back then. Well, I only have one more question for you, Joel, and it's this. Your father's colleague, Abe Lastfogel, used to say you should always return every phone call because the one you don't could be the one that would have made you $1 million. Yes. Do you follow that advice?
Most of the time. Most of the time. I think I think about it all the time. Like, especially if somebody has called me and it's like, I don't have the energy for it or whatever. And I say, oh, Mr. Lastfogel says you should return every phone call. So I try to 9 out of 10 times.
I'm glad you do, because I do too. And I have to tell you, it's been such a pleasure meeting you. Thank you for writing the book and giving us all a chance to get to know your dad. And most of all, thank you so much for taking the time to appear on our show.
Well, it's been my pleasure, Harvey. I really appreciate it. It means the world to me that you were so touched by it. And thank you so much.
Well, I'm so happy to share my platform with you and to encourage all of our viewers to read the book. Our guest has been Joel Brokaw, whose brand new book, Driving Marilyn, The Life and Times of Legendary Hollywood Agent Norman Brokaw, is now available on Amazon and wherever books are sold. For more information about Joel Brokaw and to learn about his other books, please go to his official website, joelbrokaw.com. My name is Harvey Brownstone. Thank you all for joining us. See you next time. Thank you to my producer, Steve Silver, my managers, Rick Marcelli and Robin Bragg Marcelli at the Marcelli Company in Hollywood, my director of programming, Robert Monaghan, my PR directors, Eileen Shapiro and Jimmy Starr, and my entire team at the XPTV1 network in the UK.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to check out all the great interviews on the Harvey Brownstone Interviews YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified when new videos are posted.